dzień. W niedzielę bij matkę, bij ojca, bij siostrę, bij młodszego i kradnij, bo wszystko dokoła, wszystko jest twoje, 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 wszystko.
This is Criteria.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras. I'm here with my co-host, James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hey, Thomas. How's it going?
Good. We are recording remotely today because James is a little under the weather, but today is nonetheless a very exciting episode. It's our first recording of the new year. B, I guess I'm using letters, so I'll go with B. B, this is our final episode of discussing Krzysztof Kieslowski's 10-part short film series, The Decalogue, inspired by the 10 Commandments made for Polish television in the late 80s. We have been doing these one at a time, about every 3 weeks or so. We took a break halfway through. We are now finishing this series, and we were talking about doing a separate episode after this to wrap it up, but I think we both realized we just kind of want to be done.
Yeah, I don't know.
Didn't want to yeah.
It's bittersweet because I, on the one hand, am sad to see this series go. It's been this sort of constant companion with us through the whole of this podcast so far, from the beginning. And I think that they were great films to really cut my teeth on doing this podcast, right? I mean, we were covering other movies too, but having this as a touchstone to return to as we were covering all these other films, I really feel like I owe a lot to this Decalogue series in kind of forming my eye and training me in this sort of layman's form of film criticism that we've been undertaking.
Yeah, but we kind of felt like we didn't really want to do a whole other episode after this.
Yeah.
We were kind of excited to just put a conclusion on it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but there's one more. There's a C. And C is, this is our 50th episode of Criteria.
I didn't even know.
Our final 10th episode of Decalogue is our 50th episode of Criteria. Now that's if you count a bonus episode that I cross-posted from the Catholic Culture podcast where Nathan Douglas and I discussed Walker Percy's novel, The Moviegoer. But I figured I should count that so that our 10th episode of Decalogue would be our 50th episode of the podcast. So that includes our introductory episode. So this is our 48th film discussion, but it is our 50th episode of Criteria.
Wow.
So that is also a milestone. Kieslowski fed us these bleak episodes, 9 in a row, and then he decided to end it on a light note, with some comedy.
I don't know about that. It's like a very particular Polish brand of comedy.
Yes, but it is much lighter. It's much more cartoonish. It is dark comedy. I mean, there's joking about selling a kidney, for a stamp, but it's still, compared to the others, the tone is quite different.
Sure.
And so this episode, of course, inspired by the 10 Commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Can put it very simply, this is about two brothers who inherit their neglectful father's very, very valuable stamp collection and the sort of paranoia and covetousness and hijinks that ensue from that. And, it's interesting because this film opens, the younger of the brothers is in a rock band. And this film opens with his concert. And the song, I wish I had written down some of the lyrics, but the song is basically, it's like a parody of a degenerate rock song where he's just encouraging people to fornicate and kill. I think he says to beat your juniors, which was my favorite line. But it's almost like a parody, and but he's listing all these different transgressions, and so it's like a nice summing up of the different commandments and transgressions of those commandments that we've been dealing with. I don't think he lists, all 10 in order or anything like that, but
he is going through the commandments. But
he even says there's even a line that's like, on Sunday, beat your mother. And it's like, so we've got the Lord's Day in there. We've got honoring your father and mother. Right.
And the refrain is everything is yours.
Yes.
So, and this ties directly to this subject of covetousness or coveting. And I think it's interesting, that it opens this way, not just within the broader context of the series as a whole, like giving it this there's almost like this recapitulation of everything that's come before right in that opening sequence, but also that it kind of sets the stage. It's almost as if he makes his bed and now he has to lie in it. It got me thinking immediately about how we do this all the time, whether it's in, it's mainly in the values that the world holds, the values that the secular world holds dear are things that we look up to, that we idealize, that we glamorize. But then when people actually have to live in them, it's a different matter. Right. So oftentimes that connection is lost between what you're singing about and how, rock and roll and rebellious and cool it might sound, and then what the world is like when people actually listen to what you're saying.
And we don't get the impression that this is a guy who goes around beating people up or killing people. But he's actually a fairly nice guy.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I would say that in this Decalogue, whereas in previous Decalogues, we see sort of our main characters being the primary subjects of, this wrestling with the commandments. I think that more so in this one, the brothers are in a world of others who are coveting what they have.
Right.
So although they do they do fall into the sins of their father, and we can get into that, how they become guilty of a kind of covetousness themselves. Mm-hmm. Primarily, it seems to be others around them who are coveting what they have. Mm. So it's like he has to live in a world now where others actually live by this sort of mantra that he's singing. Everything is yours.
That's a great point. Yeah. Well put, man. Yeah, that's very true. And it also, the song also it's very different musically from what's come before the series, obviously. It sets up a shift in tone for the episode. It brings us into sort of like these modern Western musical forms, coming in. I'm trying to think of what other examples of contemporary music we heard we heard some classical music, some opera, right? In number 9. Yes?
Yep.
Yes, number 9. Yeah, number 9.
Yeah, okay.
And then we also the other example I can think of is in number 6, when he goes into the young man goes into the living room where his woman, the older woman who takes care of him,
yeah.
is watching TV, and you hear this sort of cheesy,
Right.
music, which is what you would expect, sort of Polish, behind the Iron Curtain, behind by a couple decades, pop music to sound like, right?
Sure.
Sort of has this sort of polka-y quality to it or something.
Yeah.
And now we've got this like very up-to-date sort of punk rock coming in. So there's something in that too, where you're getting like a modernization, a sort of like Western things coming in.
Right. And it's already comic at the beginning because the other brother, the older brother, is arriving at the concert, trying to push through the crowd to tell him that their father has died. And he's having a real hard time at it. And it's just kind of funny. So right away, it signals a lot of things about this tone shift here at the end. And I think it's totally appropriate given how far we've come in this series for Kieslowski to kind of turn it on its head right at the end.
Yeah. And I think that the 10th Commandment is a good, not that any of these are laughing matters, but if the 10th Commandment in particular, I think lends itself to human beings making fools out of themselves.
That's
in
right.
a comical
That's right.
way, right?
Yeah, well, because whereas in the instance of like, thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not commit adultery, the sort of the object of your sinfulness is a human person. Here it's like it's an object through and through,
Sure.
And
it's referred to your neighbor. It's your neighbor's goods, but the object of it in every other instance is a person, whether it be God, your parents, whatever,
Right.
So there is something, it's beneath, it's by nature, it's making a fool of yourself. It's something that's so obviously beneath human
and the
aspirations.
The fact that what they are all coveting in this film is a stamp collection is it just makes it all the more kind of comical,
Right.
I don't care how cool the stamps are. It's like at the end of the day, they're all losing their minds over these stamps.
Right.
So
we get at the funeral, we get this very pompous speech by one of their father's friends about, how he sacrificed everything for this noble aim.
Yeah.
Which is not, explicitly said. We don't find out that he's a stamp collector until they open up the cabinets in their father's apartment and see what it was he was getting these medals for.
Yeah.
But, he sacrificed his family, his health, everything else.
His career, everything.
For
this noble pursuit.
The younger brother is standing at the funeral in the cemetery, listening to his band's own song on his headphones. I'd like to talk about, I like these actors, but in particularly the older brother.
Yeah.
I really love.
He's great.
He kind of carries the comedy, I think, to a large extent in this film. He's very well cast. He's got the perfect face to be coveting stamps.
Yeah.
He's got great expressions. Got sort of a nervous gloom to him. Jerzy Stur. How do you pronounce that? By the way,
it's pronounced Jerzy.
Jerzy Stur.
It's the Polish equivalent of George.
Okay. Both of these guys, as often, have connections to other Kieslowski films. Jerzy Stur was in his first major feature film, Camera Buff, in 1979. I think he played the main character. I haven't seen that one yet. And I also just wanted to mention he became very popular with younger viewers after he provided the voice for Donkey in the Polish dubbed version of Shrek.
Wow.
He also provided the voice of Mushu the Dragon in Disney's Mulan and Mulan 2.
Way to go, Jerzy.
There you go. And then the other guy, the younger brother, played by Zbigniew Zamachowski, was, I think, the main character, or he was at least in Three Colors White.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So I like both of these actors. They're a nice contrast, that the older brother is, he's a businessman. He's maybe semi-successful, but still hurting for cash a little bit. And the younger brother is the complete opposite. He's dressed in this cool but somewhat absurd looking sort of military jacket. And
yeah, it's very bohemian.
Right. It's got the scarf, the
Right.
bandana.
Yeah, what I like about the older brother and the performance that's given is that at the beginning, you almost expect him to be this kind of straight-laced, no-nonsense, average Joe businessman type, but we see him kind of descend into ridiculousness, so
Right.
that at certain points he almost resembles Gollum. He's kind of like
when he's like laughing nervously as he accuses his brother of stealing the stamps.
Yeah. But
He's
also
like grinning.
Also, when he's at the apartment late at night, his younger brother, thinks that someone's broken into the apartment and is trying to steal something. He busts in there,
He's just
and
in
it's
this
his older
little
brother
lamplight.
just in the dark, laughing, looking at the stamps, and it's very
It's
like
great.
riddles in the dark kind of vibes.
That's very true.
Yeah. So I was thinking a lot about Gollum and Lord of the Rings as I was watching this, because there too, in Lord of the Rings is this kind of dynamic of coveting an object and how it sort of begins to change the person who's holding it. But of course here it's just way less. It's just way more ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, where should we go from here then?
Well, I think that one of the things that I really liked about this being the final entry in the series, obviously Kieslowski's hands are tied to a certain extent because he has been tracking the commandments as he's been going through. There has been, kind of a one-to-one selection of his theme based on the actual order in which the 10 Commandments are laid out. And so he has to deal with coveting thy neighbor's goods in this 10th installment. But I thought that there was something really appropriate to that. And I began to think this when I saw the moment sort of halfway through the film where the two brothers are kind of assessing their father's apartment for security problems. And they're outside, they're looking at the windows and at the balcony, and they're saying we should put up some bars, anybody could just drop in and get in there. And they both look like they're just having a really good time. And the older brother turns to the younger brother and says, I've forgotten all of my problems.
Right.
And the younger agrees, and he says, it's childish. It's like when we were children. And again, the older brother is like, yeah, it feels good. It feels very good. And I kind of thought about how isn't that just the way with sin in general? Is this chasing after a false peace? It's often said, appropriately so, that the primal sin is pride, that this is the first sin of our parents in disobeying God in the garden. But this episode made me think about how before that sin comes into play, they behold the apple, the forbidden fruit. And I think in scripture it says, that Eve saw that it was good for eating. And so there is something I think very fundamental about seeing something, desiring it, and desiring to possess it, that kind of runs across all of these sins.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about how, the false peace that offers, the false escape that sin offers, because the younger brother elaborates. He says, maybe none of it exists. Maybe we're referring to the problems that they've forgotten about because they're so wrapped up in this task of dealing with the stamps and protecting them. He says, maybe none of it exists. How does he put it? He says, if you don't want it to exist, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems to be like the lie that sin offers, that if you don't want it to exist, it doesn't. And that for a lot of us, it's a turn to sin is a turn to a false peace or a false escape from our problems.
Right.
I know that in my case, whenever I've been wrapped up in something, say it's like a distraction, entertainment, addicted to scrolling on the phone or whatever, it's that momentary release from all of the things that I need to worry about. But the real peace that God offers is the peace that I sometimes glimpse in Mass or in praying the Rosary or in adoration. I think that adoration is sort of the antithesis of covetousness. So what we're doing in coveting an object is kind of the perverted opposite of adoring God. And the peace that comes from adoration does involve this sort of movement away from our problems, but not in the sense of, it's like they're no longer problems. They're no longer actually problems. I'm not worried about them in the way that I was. I'm not afraid of them or dominated by them in the way that I was, because I'm with God, and who can be against me? So in the return to my problems, in the return to the rest of my life and all of its, exigencies and demands and challenges, I'm encouraged and not defeated. Whereas with sin and with this sort of this rapture that comes from obsession and getting involved in sin, there is no return to your problems, because you're trying to escape them to begin with. When you face your problems again after sin, they're just bigger because they haven't gone away. Right. It doesn't stop existing because you don't want it to. And we see that played out in this film, in the sacrifices that begin to be made by both brothers, but in particular by the older brother, because he's, away from his family. He tells the younger brother that his wife suspects him of having an affair. Right.
It's like it goes from he misses a dentist appointment to for his son to his wife now thinks he's cheating on her. So it escalates.
He sells the family car. He begins to do the very things that his father did, the very things that the two brothers resent their father for having done. The pain
they resent him for it, and they also profess not to understand it.
That's
and I think that's an important part of this as well.
Yeah.
Because and I don't know that they're being hypocritical or dishonest when they say that. There's this dialogue between them, like what leads someone to covet? And he says, the younger brother says, well, you like material things. He says, yeah, but I use them. I enjoy my comforts, but I use them. The things themselves don't hold value for me. And I think that's a valid thing to say.
Sure.
But what they come to ultimately, perhaps in a relatively costless way, in this film, because the stakes ultimately it resolves in a way that sort of makes them laugh at themselves, they come to understand their father's fault better from the inside. And I think that also ties in together with the theme of fatherhood that we've been dealing with for so many of the episodes in this series.
That's right.
So there is a sort of reconciliation.
That's a good point. In a sense. That's a good point. Yeah, because if this is one thread that we've been tracking more or less through all of these episodes, and this was not something at the outset that I was expecting, but it's been there from the beginning. This theme of the sins of the father, basically.
Right.
Well, here we have two adult men admitting that they don't understand their father's sins. And so they get burned precisely by their father's sins.
Right.
This man is dead. He's gone. The stamp collection means nothing to him. But the sins that he committed in his life continue to bear their evil fruit in the lives of his sons. And because they haven't worked to understand the sins of their father, to say nothing of forgiving the sins of their father, they're totally, hapless victims when all of this comes their way, when they inherit all of this as they as everybody one day will. So I think that there's something to that by the end they understand it, but it's almost as if, you're going to have to go through this one way or the other. You're going to understand the sins of your father, at the outset and forgive them before you have to suffer the consequences, or you're going to understand them from the inside, dealing with them intimately as they like wreak havoc in your life. And you
but
pass
on the
them
other
on
hand,
to the next generation.
Yeah, but also I think that, there is a part of them that is probably trying to connect with their father in some way.
I see.
Like, it's not just that they're interested in the stamps and the money for the value of them for its own sake, because they talk about, well, let's not sell it yet. I think that there is a part of them that wants to connect with him, because they say that he's been absent in their lives. And so there is something where they are, with their faults, and their blindness, they are still going on a necessary journey, and they still are seeking something positive in trying to connect with their father.
If their father had loved them instead of loving his stamp collection, then this would not have been something that they had to go through.
Right.
Right. So that, I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that I think that the responsibility of the father and the way his sins are borne out in the lives of his children is something that we see as a kind of echoed and repeated theme through all of these episodes, more or less.
Yeah.
Even in like Decalogue 5, where there is no father really in. I think maybe the young lawyer becomes a father recently at the end of the film, but there's mention of the young man who commits the murder. There's mention of his father, I think, if I recall correctly, and the effect that his father and his upbringing had on him. And so, even I only mention that because that was one instance where the father wasn't explicitly present, but still is worked into the film by Kieslowski in the writing or in the backstory. So here is this sort of explicit reconciling with the sins of the father that doesn't always happen in the other ones. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a very appropriate ending point, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned responsibility, and that is sort of a theme as well. And it seems to me that, well, let me read something that Kieslowski said. So he said a number of times that he said that he believed, this is in his commentary on Decalogue in the book Kieslowski on Kieslowski.
Yeah.
And he said he did believe in an absolute moral reference point, but more in terms of the God of the Old Testament than of the New. And he proceeds to lay out this very sort of cliched, theologically incorrect view of the differences between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. He says the Old Testament God was demanding and cruel, didn't forgive, and expected absolute adherence to the principles he laid down, whereas the New Testament God was a merciful, kind-hearted old man who forgives everything. And then he goes on to say, the God of the Old Testament leaves us a lot of freedom and responsibility, observes how we use it, and then rewards or punishes, and there's no appeal or forgiveness. Obviously not true. It's something which is lasting, absolute, evident, and is not relative. And that's what a point of reference must be, especially for people like me who are weak, who are looking for something, who don't know. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things you could talk about in that statement, especially when he says, that's actually what I need, is this absolute point of reference.
Right.
But what I wanted to single out specifically was this idea of leaving us a lot of freedom and responsibility and observing how we use it and allowing us to suffer the consequences. So it seems to me that if you were going to pick a subject matter for exploring the theme of moral responsibility, fatherhood would maybe be the ideal subject matter to discuss that, because the consequences are not just affecting you, but affecting others in such an immediate way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting just to think of, Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and his preoccupation with this idea of choice and responsibility and freedom, and the fact that we are given this terrible freedom and responsibility by God, and how consequential that is.
Right.
But I was talking to a friend just last night about, he was sort of lamenting the state of the world and why does God allow people to be born into a world that is so messed up that it inculcates them before they have time to make a chance to make their own choices in evil ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I said, well, why were Adam and Eve allowed to make a choice that affected the whole human race? And not just why were they allowed to make the choice, but why did God choose to ordain things such that the whole human race would be affected by their choice?
Sure.
Without having a choice to. In other words, I would be, even if I never committed a willful sin in my life, I would still be a victim of original sin.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I have an answer to that question, and what all of what we can draw from the mystery of that, where God actually allows our actions to send others to hell in a way, even though those people are still responsible for their own choices, that we still do affect others in these really decisive ways.
Yeah.
But I think that fatherhood is a great theme for exploring that, because you might say it's you might say it's unjust. Why should children not exist in isolation from the moral choices of their parents? And God does say in the Old Testament, no longer will it, the sins of the fathers be carried down to the fourth and fifth generation. It'll just be the immediate next generation. And he's talking in terms of sort of God's active punishment, not so much just the immediate intrinsic moral consequences that we're discussing here. But I don't know. There's a lot to dig into that I'm just thinking about now. But the theme of fatherhood is really the theme of responsibility, because there's nobody who has more responsibility than a father. Everybody has responsibility. And Kieslowski gives us all these wonderful, really well-drawn female characters throughout the series, but there is nobody who has more responsibility than the father.
Yeah. That's a good point. I found myself wondering while I was watching this about how the father who dies at the beginning, how he comes into this noble passion of stamp collecting, and he has some pretty old stamps. And, I think that it's as good a hypothesis as any to suppose that some of these stamps were inherited, perhaps even by his own father. It's a pretty niche interest. So,
especially in Poland under communism, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, in the screenplay, there is a dialogue between the two sons where the older son, who has more memory of the father from childhood, talks about, because the father's nickname is given as Root. And it's explained that is actually, the guy in the funeral speech explains that was his nickname when he was in, I forget what, he was basically in the Polish defense force or something at one point. And he ended up in a prison, in a communist prison for years, and came back. And then shortly afterwards, he received a letter from an old comrade in arms and became fixated on the stamp, and that's how his fixation begins.
Interesting.
In the screenplay, but none of that is explained at all.
Right.
In this film.
How strange. I wonder if there's anything to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought about it that much, but
I also will say that by the end of the film, the sort of the elusive stamp that they find themselves searching for, the Austrian Mercury rose, I thought it looked pretty darn good. I thought that looked like a pretty sweet stamp.
Oh no, a lot of these old stamps are quite beautiful.
Yeah. But I felt like the film did a good job, even for me as a viewer, of kind of getting me involved. Like, you know what, that Austrian Mercury rose would look good in that series of stamps.
Yeah.
It's funny because they end up getting the stamp, of course, but at the expense of quite a lot.
Yes.
So the older brother enters into a kind of shady deal to exchange one of his kidneys for this stamp. And not only does it sort of demonstrate how far gone he's how far he's willing to go now to acquire these stamps, but it also provides the sort of pretext for what ends up being a burglary of their apartment. So while he's in the hospital recovering and the other brother is there, he says he's there waiting for him, but really we see that he's there sort of engaging in an affair with one of the nurses there who's recognized him as the lead singer from this band. While they're distracted or otherwise disposed, the apartment is burglarized and all of it is taken. And I thought that this ending sequence was interesting too because it's not just the covetousness that does them in, but it's lust too.
Interesting. So you took it to mean that, they went off together because she's kind of smitten with him because he's in this band, and we don't see that lead to anything besides this comical scene where she asks to touch him and she touches his face.
Well, Thomas,
So
you might have missed it because of your guileless, innocent ways. No. You might have missed it. But there was this excellent montage of the surgeon getting ready with the scalpel and the knife and performing the operation, spliced with shots of the burglar breaking into the home with the blowtorch, and also shots of the nurse locking the door and we just, the camera is away. We see her nurse hat tossed off, and we also see his sort of messenger bag tossed next to it. So the clear implication.
How did I miss that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a montage.
You mean they're in the hospital?
Yeah. So they've gone into another room.
I missed
She's
that completely on both viewings,
dude, because you are a sweet summer child.
Okay. All right.
But
I prefer that interpretation to just my usual lack of observational skills.
Well, it's a quick montage, so it's easy to miss. There's a lot going on, and at that point, you don't know that the apartment's being burglarized. So you're like, blowtorch? What's going on here?
Right.
But yeah, he and the nurse who has recognized him have gone off to
I see.
What's interesting too is that she's wearing a wedding ring on her right hand. And I guess in Poland it's on the right hand that you wear the wedding ring. I looked it up. Any Polish listeners can correct me if I'm wrong. But they were very specific about the right hand being the hand that you pet the dog with. So when the burglar breaks in, he's petting the dog with the right hand. So anyway, we see the gloved hand of the burglar petting the dog with his right hand, and we see the nurse with the wedding ring petting this other sort of animal with her right hand, that he's also a guard dog. He was supposed to be at the apartment looking after the stuff. And in the same way that the guard dog is pacified with this dumb gesture, this brother is also pacified with this dumb gesture. Well, thank you. So
that's awesome.
So it's not just one sin that's doing them in. It's this whole network of sins. And so that's like another sense in which I see this final installment as being a kind of summation of everything that's come before. It's, there's a lot of sins that are being committed in these final moments that lead to their being left with nothing but the one stamp that he traded his kidney for, which is still worth a lot of money, but of course there's nobody who's willing to pay that money. None of these stamp collectors really have millions of dollars. It's only worth the exchange. So, yeah.
Random thing. One of my favorite things in the movie is the street kid who Yezha's I think the character and the actor are both
That's
named
right.
Yesha.
That's right.
His son innocently trades, these valuable Zeppelin stamps for a big pile of worthless stamps. And just this kid is like such a obvious scumbag just from his appearance. Like he looks like an anime character. He's got this dyed blonde hair, these stupid annoying sunglasses, this nasty smirk.
Yeah,
I just loved that. I thought that was the perfect.
Yeah, well, it's kind of fascinating,
appearance.
the whole interaction with him, because Yezha goes from being this kind of unassuming square to roughing up this kid in this back alley over these stamps, and so it's interesting to track his craftiness through the film, because almost right away he recognizes what's going on when he's at his father's apartment going through things, and one of his creditors comes asking for payment and says, well, if you don't have the money, I could pick something of commensurate value here. And you see in Yezha's eyes this immediate recognition, this guy is trying to rip me off. And that's also when you really begin to sense that he begins to value the stamps. Up to that point, anytime the brothers talk about the stamps, they're just talking about selling them, getting rid of them.
Yeah.
But it's really at that point that you begin to see in Yezha a kind of shift. He begins to desire the stamps more because there's someone here who's desiring them, and desiring them so much that he's trying to rip him off. Yeah. And he tells the brother, that guy was crafty, too crafty to be dealt with. But very quickly, we see that Yezha is very capable of this himself too. He roughs up the kid, and then he goes to the shop where the kid claims to have sold the stamps, and he does this whole kind of bluff where he basically threatens to get the cops involved, and his hand is overplayed, or outplayed rather. But nevertheless, you really get the sense of him being in his element. It's almost like Breaking Bad. It's like this pre-Breaking Bad kind of.
I see.
Yeah. So
I like the character of the stamp, the shop owner.
Yeah.
I thought that was a great performance as well.
Totally. Very cool.
And that just the idea that there's this whole sort of underworld.
Yeah.
Of stamp people.
Totally. Yeah, they're all total gangsters. It's very funny.
I think that word is used in the film.
Yeah.
In fact, I think Yezha refers to them as a bunch of gangsters. I think he says the English word gangster in his Polish accent.
Yeah. So, it's funny. Before we came on to do this episode, I wasn't so sure how I might attempt at taking a stab at any wrap-up comments about.
I feel like we've already done it.
Yeah, it's really cool. I didn't really even think about it until we had this conversation about just how appropriate this was as a final installment in this series. And you can imagine it not going that way. You can imagine it being really just another installment, so that these pieces could be watched in whatever order and rearranged and mixed and matched. But really, there is kind of a definite progression. There does seem to be an arc that the stories take you through from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. Okay, so at the end of this episode, while they still suspect each other, and right before they realize how they got ripped off and that the other brother is not guilty. Yeah. Both of them independently go to the post office, where we see our young man from Decalogue 6. Yeah. And they both decide to buy one each of the newly issued stamps there. And then at the end, the final scene is they find that they both have these stamps, and that's the seed for a new collection, right?
Yeah.
And they're kind of laughing at themselves. And but I wanted to know what you think the meaning of that final purchase of stamps is, my reading is that they're sort of trying to console themselves for the loss of this collection.
Yeah.
Independently, they both still suspect each other. And then it sort of shifts at the end when they realize what they've both done.
Yeah.
And sort of like probably implicitly realize like how they've fallen into their father's vice, and start laughing at themselves. Is that sort of how you read it?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it almost seems as if there's like a certain inevitability. There's a certain inevitability to it all. Ugh, why is that such a weird word? It almost seems as if it's inevitable that Yezha's gonna go. It's like a dog going back to his vomit, Like you can't get over it that quickly. So there's nothing else to do but go back to get some stamps. It's like why the gambler who's lost everything, goes back to the casino, or why the tippler goes back to the bottle. But what's nice is that even that at the end with this laughter from the two of them, there's a real sense of freedom that in this moment they're being freed from what has consumed them for the whole film. And it's like it's depressing still. It's not depressing in the same way that a lot of these other films in the Decalogue series have been depressing. But like, when I was watching it and seeing their home getting burglarized as he's giving up his kidney, I was really distressed. It did not sit well with me. I was very upset. So it still kind of gets you in the gut, but there's genuine consolation in the laughter that they share at the end, and genuine hope that, despite all that has been spent, all that this sort of episode in their life has cost them, it's not going to be what it cost their father, which was his whole life,
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I was really nervous about like what to say in wrapping up the series, but I feel like the episode itself gave us, a way of doing that.
Thanks, Kieslowski. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, it was nice. It's nice to end on a somewhat lighter note,
Yeah. It's funny. Like when this is the lighter note,
Right. Yeah.
It gives you a sense of just how light everything else has been.
I was going to suggest that, like, one of the problems in doing a whole wrap-up episode for me was, like, we've extended this series over so much time.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know when we started, but it was, like, a year and a half ago or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe a year ago that we started discussing the Decalogue. I don't know. So I don't feel like that fresh on all of the episodes anymore. You know? So I have a suggestion, and we don't have to commit this now, which is that maybe like I feel like 1 year from now still feels too soon. But like maybe if we're still doing this podcast like in 2 years, we just do an episode where we watch. I don't even want to go back and listen to our episodes. I've already done that because I do that for making clips and stuff, but like, just go back and watch the whole series in like a week.
Yeah, totally.
And then do a big picture episode, like a Decalogue revisited.
Sure.
Single episode.
Yeah. It would be a great way of reviving these older episodes if we are still around 2 years from now, because I'm really proud of, I'm not, maybe proud's the wrong word, but I'm really grateful for the experience that we've had in going through these films, because I feel that with each of them, my sort of what I got from the film, my takeaway was so much enhanced by our discussion, and that's not always true of everything that. I mean, I'd say that my my takeaway is somewhat enhanced of every film by our discussion afterwards. But with these in particular, these short hour-long films really gave so much to be kind of mulled over and reconsidered. And I thought that, you know, what we ended up doing with each of these episodes,
for me, there's usually some level of epiphany that occurs in the discussion, if only just from listening to your thoughts on it, you know?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I really do think that for any of our listeners who either have only listened to these episodes and not watched the films, I can't recommend them enough. Hopefully by now on episode 10, you're convinced. But if anyone happens to be listening to this who hasn't heard any of those previous episodes, they're definitely worth going back and listening to. I would recommend them in particular because I think they have so benefited me in my understanding of these films and what I got out of each one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if we'll ever discuss any of his other films.
Definitely. Oh man, we have to. It's going to be like Yezha going to the post office and buying the stamps. You know, after a month or two of not doing any Decalogue movies, I'm going to be like, oh man, I need to get some Kieslowski up on Criteria.
Well, you know, as I've discussed before, I've watched a great many of his early documentary shorts.
Yeah.
I've seen his first, maybe it's his second feature, The Scar. Not that noteworthy. I think that generally people seem to say that they seem to encourage like starting with Camera Buff as like the first installment of the classic sort of peak artistry Kieslowski films. So you've got like Camera Buff. I think No End was the first one where Piasevich, however you pronounce it, started writing with him, and then he wrote all of the rest of Kieslowski's films with him. The one that my favorite is Three Colors Blue. I haven't seen the other Three Colors films yet. There are some scenes in there that are probably more explicit than anything in Decalogue that have held me back from recommending it unless in the context of like a full discussion of the film.
Sure.
You know? But I have to say, I certainly enjoyed it more and found it more cinematically fulfilling than the Decalogue series.
I don't remember Three Colors Red and White very well. But I think that probably in Red, there's a little bit more of that too than is ever found in the Decalogue series.
Yeah.
And then certainly also, I think in Double Life of Veronique, it does get more explicit than it gets in
he was making films in France at that point, you know? I don't know if that makes a difference.
Well, Mills French, yeah.
Yeah. But I think his last film was Red.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
I think it's blue, white, and then red.
Okay.
Well, so maybe we'll discuss those at some point anyway. I don't know what else we would discuss by him.
I think that's about it, right? I mean, he doesn't have a very large filmography, does he?
Yeah. I mean, as far as the ones that are really considered classics.
Yeah.
I'd also be interested in discussing some other Polish films, you know. Andrzej Wajda is a really important filmmaker, sort of contemporary or maybe slightly older than Kieslowski. They went to the same school. I've seen his film from 1950, Diamonds and Ashes, which is quite interesting.
Cool.
And deals much more with communism and political things. The films of Agnieszka Holland. I have not seen any of her Polish films, but she does a lot. I remember she was mentioned by Maria Elena de las Carreras when we talked to her in our episode on Decalogue 5. So there's a number of other Polish filmmakers that I haven't really delved into too much, but that might be worth exploring. I don't know if there's any major Polish filmmakers who are sort of practicing Catholics or not. But I'd be interested to find that out. as well.
Yeah.
But certainly Kieslowski must be the most famous, internationally famous Polish director.
Yeah.
Probably with Andrzej Wajda coming close behind.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, anything else to say here? I'm kind of like, oh, well, how are we going to be changing our schedule? So we've been doing these every few episodes, doing these decalogues, and they've been sort of taking up, so the two options going forward, are either just like powering through the rest of the Vatican film list at a faster pace because we don't have to do these decalogues, or what I think we are both leaning towards is doing our every few episodes, instead of doing a decalogue, doing a film that's not on the Vatican film list.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're over halfway through the Vatican
we are
film
like
list now.
About exactly halfway through the list now.
So I think we can afford.
I think we're like 23 films through now that we finished Decalogue.
I think we can afford to branch out a little bit now. We've got our sea legs,
Yeah. So the idea, I think one of the things that I'd like to do, and I don't know how much we can keep this up. I mean, this podcast, if we continue beyond the list, I don't think it can always be like the gimmick should probably not stay like what should they have put on the list, forever. But like, but I think there is some room for that sort of thing. Like what films were neglected that were already out when the list came out, what genres were neglected, and then what films are like no-brainers if such a list were made today. I think that The Tree of Life, for example, would have to be on there.
That's a good point.
So we have a number of, things that I think for are no-brainers for us. I think that discussing, if not every film by Terrence Malick, then like quite a number of his films. Yeah. And then probably every film by Tarkovsky. I think we've already agreed that we want to do that.
Yeah.
But I think that in the immediate future, what I'd like to do is maybe go into a couple of genres that are left off the list. And one of those would be sort of straight. Now, we haven't seen all of the films, so maybe we're missing something, but sort of a straight traditional comedy, of the like romance, succeeds in the end variety, right?
Yeah.
And that would be, one of the major genres of comedy that is not represented on this list is the classic Hollywood, what's called like a screwball comedy. And so what I'm hoping to do is to cover a couple of films in that genre. And then also we haven't talked about any noir yet. And noir is a major genre, both very influenced by European films and I think influential on European films. So I think we want to do that in the foreseeable future. So I think that that's the sort of thing that people can expect to come up over the next probably 4 or 5 months, is some of those genres that we haven't been able to touch on yet. So I'm hoping that our next off-list film that we discuss that will not be a review of a new film, because we're going to be doing the new Macbeth by Joel Cohen soon as well.
Yeah.
Will probably be The Awful Truth, which is probably the best screwball comedy I've made. It's by a director who is Catholic, Leo McCarey, and stars a practicing Catholic actress, Irene Dunn. I don't know if she was practicing at the time the film was made, but so that's a really excellent film, and I'd like to discuss that with our guest host, Nathan Douglas.
Yeah.
And Tony Esselin, who was one of our earliest guests, we discussed Stagecoach with him, has already said that he'd love to discuss the films of Preston Sturges with us.
That's awesome.
Who is a major director and writer of comedy of the 40s and late 30s, early 40s. And I've already have 2 films in mind by Sturges. I was thinking that we would just select 2 Sturges films to discuss with him.
Yeah, well, because, he can't just talk about one movie. He's going to bring them all in anyway.
That's true. That's very true.
So we'll probably just have to watch them all.
So he usually connected. And when we did Stagecoach, he was mentioning all these other John Ford movies.
Yeah.
So I had 2 films by Sturges I want to discuss: Sullivan's Travels and The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. In particular, there's like 7 that are considered like the classic Preston Sturges comedies. I've seen all of them. They're all unique in their own way and great, but those are the two that I'd like to focus on. So I think we'll be doing some screwball comedies in the next few months. And then as far as the Vatican film list is concerned, I think we were saying that we wanted to do On the Waterfront next.
Yeah.
Classic American film. And I know that soon we will be doing another film by Fellini, La Strada, with another of our early guests, James Matthew Wilson, and our guest host, Nathan Douglas. So we'll have the four of us there to discuss La Strada.
Yeah, that'll be cool.
I think in late February we'll be recording that. So that'll give people an idea of what's coming up, and I figured giving a preview of how we're going to approach this now that we're halfway through the list, 50 episodes in, finish the Decalogue. That's a pretty major milestone for us, I'd say.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm excited to, get into some more stuff, get into some off film stuff. Off Vatican film list stuff. But I think our very next episode is going to be a review of the Joel Cohen Macbeth, currently in theaters, coming out on Apple TV Plus for streaming, I think on January 16th. And that stars Denzel Washington as Lord Macbeth and Frances McDormand as Lady Macbeth, and we're both really excited to see that. So, all right, well, there we go. James, thank you for being such a good co-host these 50 episodes, and particularly on these, often confounding Decalogue films. It's been invaluable to have you here.
Well, Thomas, it's my pleasure, and I think that maybe it has more to do with the Polish blood in me than anything else. So let's get more Polish films on here now that we're done with Decalogue.
Great.
Yep.
All right, thanks everybody for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please do subscribe to the Catholic Culture channel. If you would like to help us out, we produce 4 podcasts, including Criteria. Please go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. If you're new to the channel, please do check out our other podcasts. I interview a lot of different people in the areas of Catholic arts and culture on the Catholic Culture podcast. James records classic Catholic writings by the saints, the fathers of the church, etc., on Catholic Culture audiobooks. And Mike Aquilina does the history of the fathers of the church in very entertaining, bite-sized episodes on our most popular podcast, Way of the Fathers, with Mike Aquilina. So all of those are there for you to enjoy. We've hit a bunch of big milestones other than on Criteria in the Catholic Culture Podcast Network. I hit episode 100 of the Catholic Culture Podcast last year. At the end of 2021, you hit episode 100 of Catholic Culture audiobooks.
Yep.
Great achievement there. And then Mike Aquilina is, I believe, this month, January, finishing what we will be calling season 1 of Way of the Fathers, which means that he has now gone chronologically through all the fathers of the church in, I don't know how many episodes, 56 or 57 episodes.
Wow.
And so we'll be entering new territory and new subject matter about the early church soon with that podcast as well. So a lot happening, a lot converging in our podcast network, and I'm really happy with all of the different things that we have to offer here.
That's great. Yeah, well, thanks be to God, and thanks be to everyone who's listening and subscribing and letting us know what you think.
All right, James, I will see you at Macbeth.
See you soon.